Imagine walking into a room with almost nothing inside it. No decorations fighting for your attention. No constant noise. Just a single beam of light crossing an empty floor. Most people would call that room unfinished. But what if the emptiness wasn't what was missing? What if it was the most important part of the room? For centuries, Japanese artists, architects, monks, and philosophers have built their entire understanding of beauty around a single idea: that what isn't there can matter just as much as what is. They call it ma, the space between things, the silence between notes, the pause between words, the emptiness that gives everything else its meaning. In a world that never stops talking, scrolling, or demanding your attention, this ancient philosophy feels almost impossible to understand. And yet, it may explain why so many of us feel overwhelmed despite having more than any generation before us. So before we begin, don't rush to fill the silence. Because by the end of this video, you might discover that the most meaningful part of your life has never been the things you've added, but the spaces you've been too afraid to leave empty. In 1952, a pianist sat down in front of a live audience and did not play. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds, he simply sat there. The audience heard their own coughing, the creak of seats, wind against the concert hall walls. Someone eventually laughed, assuming it was a prank. The composer didn't think it was a joke. He believed he had written the most honest piece of music of his career, because there is no such thing as true silence. There is only what we choose to listen to. Even in that silent concert hall, the room was never actually empty. It was full of the audience's own bodies, their doubts, their impatience, the specific, unrepeatable sound of 4 minutes and 33 seconds that would never happen in quite that combination again. He hadn't removed the music. He'd just stopped standing in front of it. What most people don't know is that this idea didn't begin with him. He'd spent years studying Zen thought before he ever sat down at that piano. And what he stumbled toward in that silence, a culture on the other side of the world had already been refining for over 1,000 years. Not as an experiment, but as a whole way of building rooms, writing music, fighting with swords, and speaking to one another. They call it Ma, the gate, with the sun shining through the middle of it. Not a wall, not an object, a space, one that lets light pass through and change depending on the hour. In English, we don't really have a word for this. The closest we get is pause, or gap, or interval. And all three of those words carry a quiet assumption that something is missing, that the gap is waiting to be filled. Most of Western aesthetics has historically worked this way. A canvas is a surface to be covered. A room is a volume to be furnished. A conversation is airtime to be used. Emptiness in this framework is failure, an unfinished sentence, a wasted room, a silence somebody should apologize for. There's an old design principle for this instinct, horror vacui, the fear of empty space. Fill the ceiling, fill the silence, fill the calendar. An empty surface in this worldview isn't neutral. It's an itch. Ma proposes something almost inverted. The empty space isn't what's left over after the meaningful part is finished. The empty space is what gives the meaningful part its shape in the first place. A single brushstroke on an empty page isn't incomplete. The page is the composition. The branch simply proves it. Think of it like a bell. What you actually hear when a temple bell rings isn't the strike. It's the decay afterward. The tone dissolving into nothing, and the nothing that follows, carrying the sound long after the metal has gone still. If you cut the recording the instant the strike happens, you haven't just lost a few seconds of audio. You've lost the entire point of the bell. The decay isn't an afterthought to the sound. It is the sound, simply continuing in a register most of us have trained ourselves to stop listening for. That decay, that's Ma. And it isn't only an aesthetic idea. It's older than aesthetics. Long before anyone was painting branches on empty paper, Zen Buddhism had already spent centuries wrestling with a related, harder question. Not how do we walk into a traditional Japanese room and the first thing you notice is what isn't there. No furniture crowding the walls. No object without a reason. The room is defined less by what fills it than by the proportions of what's left open. The engawa, that narrow wooden veranda between the interior and the garden, isn't really inside the house, and it isn't really outside it either. It's a threshold built on purpose. A room whose entire function is to be in between. Look closer at the traditional tea room, and the architecture gets almost confrontational about it. The entrance, the Nijiraguchi, is deliberately built too small to walk through standing up. Everyone, regardless of rank, has to crouch, bow their head, and crawl inside. It isn't a design flaw. It's the point. Before a single word of conversation happens, the room has already asked something of you. Leave your status, your sword, your posture of self-importance at the gap you just folded yourself through. Inside, there's usually one alcove, the tokonoma, and inside that alcove, usually just one object. Not a shelf of belongings. One scroll, one flower, one thing, given the entire weight of an empty space to be looked at properly. In a Zen garden, that same restraint scales up. The raked gravel is not decoration around the rocks. It's an equal participant. Each line drawn into the gravel represents water, or wind, or distance. The mind is asked to complete what the hands only suggested. The garden isn't finished by the gardener. It's finished by whoever sits and looks at it. Even in flower arranging ikebana, the principle holds. A Western bouquet often aims for abundance. As many blooms as the vase can hold. Traditional ikebana frequently does the opposite. 3 stems. Considerable open air between them. The negative space around the flowers is treated as carefully as the flowers themselves. Calligraphy has its own word for this, yohaku no bai, the beauty of the blank space. A master calligrapher isn't just judged on the ink. They're judged on where they chose not to put it, how the untouched paper around the characters gives them room to be read as more than just marks. None of this is about minimalism for its own sake. It isn't decoration with the volume turned down. It's a conviction that meaning requires room to exist in, that if every inch of a room, a painting, or a bouquet is occupied, there's nowhere left for the eye or the mind to actually arrive. On a no stage, the most charged moment of a performance is often not a movement at all. It's the stillness between 2 movements, a held breath the entire audience can feel. Performers spend years training not for the gesture, but for the interval before it, learning exactly how long a pause can be stretched before it either builds unbearable tension or breaks. In swordsmanship, this idea has a name of its own, mai, literally the space of engagement. It's the precise distance between 2 opponents, measured not just in feet, but in timing. Too close and you're already dead. Too far and nothing can happen at all. Somewhere in that narrow interval is the only distance from which a decisive move is possible. And reading it correctly faster than your opponent is very often the entire fight. Sumo wrestling makes this even more visible. Before a match, the 2 wrestlers crouch at the line, glare at each other, and then straighten back up, sometimes doing this 3 or 4 times before the bout even starts. To an outsider, it can look like stalling, but that repeated, unresolved pause is doing real work, each wrestler reading the other's breath, weight, and readiness, building a tension that makes the eventual collision, when it finally comes, feel almost inevitable. The tea ceremony runs on the same clock. Every motion, folding the cloth, warming the bowl, pouring the water, is performed slower than it needs to be, with small, held pauses between each step. Nothing here is efficient. That's not an oversight. Efficiency was never the goal. Presence was. Even in 17 syllables of poetry, this same architecture appears. Traditional haiku often contain what's called a karaiji, a cutting word, whose entire job is to interrupt the poem, not to add meaning, but to insert a breath, a turn, a beat of silence the reader has to sit inside before the final image lands. Traditional shakuhachi music is built the same way. Long breaths of silence sit between notes, not as rests waiting for the next sound, but as sounds in their own right. Miss the phrasing of the silence, and you haven't just played the note wrong. You've missed the piece entirely. In every one of these disciplines, theater, swordsmanship, sumo, tea, poetry, music, mastery isn't measured only by what a person does. It's measured by how precisely they can inhabit the space where they're doing nothing at all. There's a phrase in Japanese, kuki wa yomu, to read the air. It describes the skill of understanding what's being communicated in a room without anyone having said it directly. A long pause in a conversation in many Western contexts tends to register as awkward, something to fill quickly, often with whatever thought is nearest at hand. In many Japanese social contexts, that same pause can carry more meaning than the sentence that follows it. The silence isn't a failure of the conversation. It is the conversation, temporarily continuing without words. There's a related idea, enryo, a kind of practiced restraint, a habit of holding an opinion back rather than immediately voicing it, out of consideration for the room. It isn't suppression. It's closer to leaving a chair empty at the table on purpose, in case someone else needs to sit down and speak first. You can see a version of this in something as ordinary as how people share a train platform, the instinctive, unspoken negotiation of space and distance that keeps a crowded place from ever feeling frantic. And at the heaviest moments, grief, loss, this same instinct appears again, at its most tender. Rather than rushing to fill sorrow with reassurance or advice, there's often a cultural allowance simply to sit with someone in their silence, not fixing it, not narrating it, just occupying the same ma they're standing inside. Ma, at every one of these scales, becomes something close to a form of respect. It's the recognition that another person needs room, physical, verbal, emotional, that isn't yours to fill just because you're capable of filling it. It's worth asking where an idea like this actually comes from, because ma isn't just a design preference that happened to catch on. It has roots in some of the oldest philosophical territory in East Asia. Centuries before Zen Buddhism took shape, early Daoist thought had already been circling this same idea. One old image describes a wheel, 30 spokes joined at a hub, and it's the hollow center, the emptiness at the middle, that actually lets the wheel turn and the cart move. The spokes get the credit. The whole does the work. The same text makes the point again with a bowl and a room. A bowl is useful because of the emptiness a potter shapes into the clay. A room is useful because of the empty space a builder leaves for doors and windows. What's solid gets the attention. What's hollow does the work. When Buddhism arrived and blended with these ideas, it brought its own, more radical claim that emptiness isn't a void waiting to be filled at all. It's closer to the ground everything else stands on. Not nothing in the sense of absence, but nothing in the sense of pure potential, before it has committed to becoming any one particular thing. In the 20th century, a Japanese philosopher took this even further, arguing that things don't simply exist in space. They exist because of a kind of place or field that lets them appear in the first place. Being isn't the starting point, in his view. The empty field that being shows up inside of, that's the starting point. Strangely, a European philosopher working in almost total isolation from Japanese thought was reaching for something similar around the same time, describing existence as needing a kind of clearing to become visible at all, the way a forest needs an open patch of ground before any light can reach the forest floor. Two traditions on opposite sides of the planet, arriving at a similar suspicion, that emptiness isn't what's left when meaning runs out. It might be the condition meaning needs in order to show up at all. Which brings the idea full circle. The rock garden isn't just a pretty arrangement of stone and gravel. It's a small, physical argument for a very old, very serious philosophical claim that the empty space isn't secondary to the rocks. It might be the reason the rocks mean anything at all. Every elevator has a screen. Every silence in a queue gets a phone pulled out to fill it. Videos autoplay into the next video before we've even processed the first. Notifications are engineered specifically to interrupt whatever gap might otherwise have opened up in our attention. We have built an environment that is structurally allergic to Ma. It shows up at work, too. A calendar with no gap between meetings isn't read as a sign of efficiency by the people living inside it. It's usually read as a warning sign. And yet most of us build our weeks exactly that way, as if any unscheduled hour is a resource going to waste rather than the only hour in which a genuinely new thought has room to occur. Even boredom, plain, ordinary boredom, has become almost unreachable. The 3 seconds it takes an app to load used to be nothing. Now it's long enough to reach for something else to fill it. We've gotten remarkably good at making sure the Ma never opens long enough for anything to happen inside it. And maybe that's the real reason this old idea is worth sitting with now. Not as an aesthetic to admire from a distance or a travel brochure version of Japanese minimalism, but as a direct question aimed at how you actually live. What would you notice if you let the gap stay open a little longer? The pause before replying. The walk without a podcast. The room with one thing missing that you decide not to replace. The meeting you don't schedule just so the hour after it has somewhere to go. The pianist in 1952 wasn't asking his audience to listen to nothing. He was asking them to notice everything that had been there the whole time, underneath the noise they were used to filling it with. Not the absence of something. The presence of space enough to actually feel it. Maybe the question isn't how to add more to your life. Maybe it's what you'd finally notice if you let something stay empty.